All right. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We're going to be hosting the webinar Revealing Your Family's Location. So to get a little bit started, just a little bit of housekeeping before we get too in depth. There will be a Q&A at the end, so if you could hold your questions until then, that would be appreciated. You might have noticed that the chat is disabled, so if you need help remembering what your question is, you might want to write that down and hold those on until the end. And then we'll go over them all together, or they might end up being answered at some point during the webinar. Second thing to note, the recording that we're doing now will be emailed out after we are done, and it'll be uploaded up to our YouTube, so you can check it out there or share it to any friends you might think would find it interesting. And lastly, because this is a recorded webinar, we would appreciate it if everyone could stay muted as we go out through the webinar. So keep your microphone off and save your questions until the end. All right, so just a little bit about us, about Backlog. So Backlog is an archival consulting firm that specializes in helping small institutions bridge the digital divide. So what does that mean? What do we do? There's three main areas that we really focus on. The first is archives. So we provide archival needs assessments, policy writing, and digitalization plans. So the second area of focus that we do is genealogy, such as the webinar that we're hosting tonight. So if you are doing genealogy research and need a little bit of help, we do brick wall research, verifying ancestry and findings, and lineage society applications. So the third and final area that we really focus on is family history. So this includes things like family tree books, oral history interviews, and digital family archives. So with that being said, a little bit about myself. I'm your host tonight. My name is Dimitri. I am the media coordinator here at Backlog. So I was a Fulbright grantee from 2022 to 2023, so just last year. I was teaching English in Germany on this grant. So since returning to the States, I do digitization work at the Missouri Botanical Garden, in addition to my role as media coordinator here at Backlog. If you've been to any of these webinars before, you might notice that I am not Emma. Emma is our principal and our founder of our company. She couldn't make it here tonight, so I am filling in for her. I will let Jen introduce herself. All right.
I'm Jennifer Rigsby, and I'm one of Backlog's genealogists. And before that, I worked for the St. Louis County Library's History and Genealogy Department for 7 years, where I helped researchers with all sorts of genealogy problems. But I would consider French and St. Louis to be my specialty areas. And I would like to think of my approach to research as being creative, strategic, and one that leverages all of the technology available to us. Next slide, please. And today I'll be talking to you about city directories. Now, a lot of people might think they're just a one-use source for looking up addresses, but they're actually a versatile tool. And so I'm going to share with you a few actionable strategies that you can use for your urban research. Next slide, please. And people might think of the directory as being similar to a phone book, but there are some differences because the directory was available before the use of phones. You can typically find directories going back to the mid-1800s or earlier. And then they also contain more information. And so on the next slide, we can take a look at those images. So on the top, we have an example from a phone book. And this, let's see what we have here. We have the person's name, Raymond Ledford. We have his address, and then we have a phone number. And those on the right were actually an older style of phone number that's not used anymore. And at the bottom is the city directory for the same year. And it might not look like much at first, but let's look. So the first one I've highlighted, it's a woman named Charlotte C. And in parentheses, it shows that she was the widow of Arthur J. And then down below, we'll see Raymond again, and in parentheses after his name, it says Alma A. And so that's telling us that his wife was Alma. And then on top of that, it tells us he was an engineer, and it even tells us that his employer was AT&T. So you can see that we get quite a bit more information from the directory if from a genealogical perspective. Next slide, please. Now that we've seen what the basic residential listing looks like in a directory, there are two important pages to keep in mind, and that would be the table of contents and the abbreviation page. Now, the table of contents is something you want to familiarize yourself with just to get an idea of what type of sections or information you can find within the directory so that you can think of it as a resource when something comes up in your own research. And then there's also the abbreviation page, which the directory was basically written in abbreviation. So that those are two pages that if you're working in a directory, you might want to have bookmarked. Next slide, please. The most common abbreviation you might see or think about in a directory would be for occupation. So you might see lab for laborer, BRKLYR for bricklayer, sten for stenographer. There may be occupations that you can tell what they are right away, but then maybe some that are a little more mysterious because maybe the occupation doesn't exist anymore. And then there are also locational abbreviations. These could just be like NS for north side, B or BET for between, stuff like COR for corner. Next slide, please. And then we also have names being abbreviated. So a name as short as Charles would even be abbreviated to CHAS usually. And then finally, there are residential status abbreviations. And this is something that I think can confuse people sometimes because they'll see H or an R next to an address and they'll sometimes assume it just means homeowner and renter. But this is something, again, you would want to consult the abbreviation page for because oftentimes H meant head of household and R simply meant resides. And then you may have seen B sometimes meaning border, but since these weren't necessarily the same in every directory, it's good to check the abbreviation page before assuming too much. Next slide, please. And so let's talk for a minute about women in directories, because up until around the mid-1900s or so, they were mostly composed of men. Some exceptions would be widows, as we saw in that example comparison to the phone book. And sometimes women also had their own occupations, and in those cases, they would be listed in a directory, such as a midwife. And then we also saw again that they are sometimes listed in parentheses after the husband's name. Next slide, please. And so now that we've talked about that basic information, let's talk about how the different types of information in the directory besides just those residential listings. So there's business information, including not just the person's employment, but also information about their employer, because if you can look that person up in the directory, you can probably look up their employer too. And then there's also business advertisements. On the institutional side, there's all kinds of organizations, educational facilities, orphanages that are have their own directory section. And then you also will have entertainment and recreational venues, clubs, societies. Sometimes people get the names of these from a newspaper article or maybe an obituary, and the directory is one place where you could learn more about that. Next slide, please. And so this is our first case study, and our goal is going to be to find the baptism of my great-grandfather, George Keeneland Jr., who was born in St. Louis on March 9th, 1896. And we're going to use the city directory to help us do that. So the basic problem that you would have when trying to find a baptism record would be which church of many. And you first need to narrow that down by knowing the denomination, which you might have already from just family knowledge. You might be able to deduce that from where they're buried, or in the obituary, it may mention a religious organization. Civil marriage records would have the name of a priest, minister, or other religious officiant, hopefully. And so then our basic goal is going to be to try to match up this address, match up the Keenelands with a church. So next slide, please. And the way we would do that is to look up George's parents' address in the same year he was born in the city directory. So the 1896 city directory shows a listing for George Keeneland. It says he was a salesman for the John L. Boland B&S Company, and it gives the address, it's 2418A Coleman. And so now that we have that address, we want to match it up with a church. And what we're going to do is, because we want to find the most likely church it should be in. So then we would need to go to a secondary resource. So you might have available a parish map or church maps, microfilm guides and finding aids, or even a list of parishes or churches in that year's city directory. And I should say, I know the Keenelands were Catholic, so I'm going to be using the sources for Catholic parishes in this example. Next slide, please. So the first example I mentioned is a parish map, and we're fortunate to have this available in St. Louis because someone mapped out all of the open and closed parishes onto a Google map. You may have this available in another city where you're looking. You may only have a modern map to go off on, and that can be problematic because a modern parish map that's meant for active use isn't going to list these closed churches. And if we look at this image here, this is just a zoomed in section. You can see the colored stars, and those are churches that are still open, and then the black diamonds are closed. And the little, or it's not so little, it's the biggest thing on there, but the red marker is the Keeneland's address. So you can see that that red marker is pretty close to one of those black diamonds. And in the case of this map, if you click on it, the person who made it even put in the dates of opening for the church. So if you click on that, for example, and you see that the church was opened and closed before George was ever born, that's probably not going to be very helpful to us. And so we might then instead look at maybe what that purple star just above is. And and then if you, even in this example, if you click on it, it'll also tell you the language spoken or the ethnicity that originally predominated. So you'll just want to make sure that information matches up as far as ethnicity and timing. So next slide, please. Oh, and that's St. Teresa of Avila, I should say, the one, the black diamond that's close to there. So that's a church we would want to look at for this example. Next slide. And so if you don't have a map like that available, there are some other resources where you can find the churches. So microfilm guides or finding aids are probably going to be available for you just because as a way to just catalog that information. So these would list the churches by alphabetically, but maybe also by location, year of founding, or ethnicity. In St. Louis, we're lucky to have a resource that sorts it by all of those things. So we've have a link to these resources on the webpage for this talk, which you'll be provided with. And something else you would find in a microfilm guide or finding aid would be a summary of the records. So it's helpful to look at these even if you already have identified a church, because you can make sure that they have baptisms in the year you're looking for. And then you would also find microfilm numbers, hopefully something like a family search microfilm number, so you can look it up online quickly. And next slide, please. And then another way you can find a listing of churches would be in the city directory itself for the same year of the baptism. And that's helpful because in that case, it's only going to list the churches that were open in this year. And depending on the denomination and the year, there may be a lot of churches, and that makes this method possible, but may also be inefficient. Although if you use that to create your own parish map, I'm sure other genealogists would be very appreciative of that. And then if we look at this city directory image for a second, you can see that it's sorted by denomination. So this page shows Methodist and some Presbyterian churches. In this case, there's only a handful of Methodist churches, so you could pretty easily look up where they're located to match something up. And something else interesting is that it lists, we see the name of the pastors at the Methodist churches. So if you had a name of a religious officiant on your marriage record that maybe you couldn't quite read, you might be able to match it up with a name in the directory here. So next slide, please. So, I guess spoilers, we find the baptism of George on the first try using that parish map. It was St. Teresa of Avila. The line for his baptism, it's went over 2 pages, but it's at the little image at the bottom there. It gives us the same street name on Coleman. And so it's not unexpected to find this on the first try, because the goal here is that we're narrowing down to the most likely church. So therefore, we're not just randomly checking churches that we thought a family might be associated with somehow. And though while you can expect this strategy to work most times, you may need to still check multiple churches in some cases. For example, there may be more than one church that appears to be about the same distance from the family's address, so you may need to check both in that case. And then, of course, if the closest parish that you find wasn't open at the time, or say it was Italian and you're looking for an Irish ancestor, they might not have gone to that church, and you may need to look for another one in the area. And if you check multiple churches that and still aren't finding it, then you may look back at the city directory and see if the family moved before, or surrounding the birth, because if they move, they may have ended up doing this at a different church. So you could check the year before and after the baptism too. Next slide, please. And for our second case study, we're going to look at some of the organizational information in the directory. So we can look at my ancestors, the Dunsfords. We have John Dunsford, who's listed as a rope maker for Gould and Hegney in 1866. And that probably doesn't mean anything to you unless we're related. But to me, it does mean something, because I know that John was married to a woman named Emma Gould. So that could possibly set me off on other research directions. Maybe this tells us how they met. Maybe this tells us something to do with John's, relationship he had with his employer due to this familial connection. So back looking at the directory, below John are listed John Dunsford and George Dunsford. And those were actually his sons. Typically, you wouldn't find someone's children listed in the directory, but in this case, they were, apparently, because they were students at the Bryant, Stratton, and Carpenter's College. Then if you see something like that in the directory, naturally you would wonder what that school is. So we can actually use the directory to find more information on that. Next slide, please. And of course, if we go to the table of contents, that will be the best place for to figure out where to go in this giant book. And so we have 3 different sections that could be relevant to this question: academies and schools, colleges, universities, and C, and that means etc. if you didn't know, and then educational. So the school appears under the colleges, universities, etc. category, and it tells us that it was actually a business college. And it says Darby's Marble Building, corner of 5th and Olive Streets. And then below it proceeds to even tell us who the faculty were. So some of the interesting ones, we have A.H. Hinman, professor of penmanship. We have several teachers of accounts. And then J.H. Terry, Esquire, lecturer on commercial law. So this gives us an idea of some of the types of courses the Dunsfords may have been taking at the time, as well as the types of skills they were bringing into their adult lives. And one important thing to note about this example is that it only appears in this year of the directory that they were attending that school. So if you didn't look at that year, you might never know an ancestor attended a school or had some kind of association with an organization. Next slide, please. Okay, then on to our third case study, and this covers a problem that I think all researchers have at some point, which is when you know a family exists and you can't find it in our modern census databases. So this is going to give a way to solve that problem. So in my case, I couldn't find my great-grandparents in the 1940 census, and those were Robert and Marjorie Rigsby. And yet I could find them in the 1940 city directory. And so they're listing here on the right, we have Robert L., and it shows in parentheses Marjorie because that was his wife, commercial artist, and it says they lived on 5974A Kennerly. So we want to note that address down. And one thing we want to keep in mind with that is that it's an even number household. And that's because census takers didn't walk back and forth across the street in order to capture the houses in house number order. They were just walking straight up the street. So everyone on the even number side is going to appear next to each other. And the people on the odd side, for who knows, they could even be in another enumeration district for all you know. So, so you want to especially keep in mind if it's an even or odd number house. Next slide, please. And so what we're going to do is we're going to consult a reverse directory in order to figure out who the Rigsby's neighbors were. And that's going to allow us to, instead of searching the Rigsbys, we're going to search the names of their neighbors and then hopefully manually navigate to the Rigsbys on the census, or at least where they should be. So the reverse directory started to be printed in regular city directories, maybe around 1920 and later. And there are some earlier examples if you're before that we'll go over. And what the reverse directory did is instead of sorting people alphabetically, it did it by house number. So you can see them arranged and how they relate to each other geographically, which is a lot more useful to us in this case. So over on the right, we can look at who the Rigsby's neighbors are. So we have looking at the people with the even number houses, Harry V., Erwin Kufner, James Cunningham, and James's name is abbreviated to JAS, and John Hayes, John Kuhn. And so you would want to note down several of these because we have to keep in mind we already can't find the Rigsbys, so we have no idea what's going on this census page. So it's best to just write down as many names, several names, so you can search multiple of them in case we also can't find these other people for some reason. And next slide, please. Okay, so searching the names of some of those neighbors, it brings up census page. And so we can go from the bottom up, looking at that image, we have John Kuhn, James Cunningham, John Hayes, those names that we saw on the reverse directory. But then just above that, we have the Rorbagon family. And looking at it more closely, we see they are at the right address on Kennerly. His wife's name's Marjorie, and farther on the image, if it weren't cut off, it even says he's an artist. So we can easily match this Rorbagon family up to the Rigsby's city directory entry and conclude that, yes, the census taker, instead of writing Rigsby, wrote Rorbagon. And so no amount of searching for Rigsby would have ever brought this census record up. And one maybe interesting thing to note is if you can see the vertical text on the census image, someone actually wrote at some point that these names were not found in the enumeration district. So at some point, when the census was taken, someone knew that something wasn't quite right here. Next slide, please. And there are other reverse directories available. So before that, more comprehensive directory was available as a in the back of the regular city directory or printed as a second volume. There were also Gould's Red Book, which was a commercial directory, and also the Blue Book, which listed prominent citizens. And both of those have a more narrow range of a use case, because this would only work in this strategy if your ancestor happen to live nearby one of these people, but it is a possibility. And in more recent decades, we have the Haynes directories, which are I think they might be called crisscross directory, but it's the same thing. Next slide, please. Now, if you're looking for someone in a census year before a comprehensive reverse directory, you can actually use a digitized version of the regular city directory, and you'll want to take advantage of the search function we have there now. So what you can do in that case, it gets a little bit more labor intensive, but you can search the street name, and that will give you all of the results of where that street name comes up. Hopefully the street name isn't someone's first name, but in all other cases, you should be able to find various hits, and you can kind of sift through those results to look for neighbors who have a nearby address. Again, keeping in mind that you want an even number house if you're looking for an even number house, and an odd number house if you're looking for an odd number house. That still applies in this case. And so if you're doing it this way, you can still basically do the same strategy. You just have to go through more results to get there. And we provided a link to a listing of digitized city directories in St. Louis. Other places you could look would be archive.org. There's a lot of digitized directories there that are searchable. And even just Googling a directory with, the city name, city directory, and a year, that can also bring up results. And if you can't match the exact year, you can try to work with a nearby year, in hopes that all of the neighbors didn't, up and move over a few years. Next slide, please. So our final case study is going to look at the commercial listings. And this example dates back to when I was an intern at the Missouri History Museum Library. And I was doing research on a German Schützen rifle they owned, which was made by a man named John Blickensdorfer. And so doing that, I used the directory to help understand things such as when he started in business and when and closed, because you can track him over directory years to see when he's listed and when he's no longer listed. Another interesting thing is that you would find people in the same category of business partnering up with each other over the years, so their listings would evolve. On this image, we have the that shows a couple of the categories in the commercial directory. So there's both guns and pistols and gunsmiths. There's a lot of overlap in the names there. And there could be several relevant categories for any, person's business. And so down under gunsmiths, we have John Blickensdorfer, and he and it was something interesting to note on his is that it says see advertisement page 782. And so that's actually telling us that he has an advertisement in this year's directory. Next slide, please. And then on the left here, we have the advertisement image. It says he was a manufacturer of guns, rifles, pistols, and air guns. So that gives us more of an idea of what specifically he was manufacturing. And at the bottom, it says repairing done with neatness and dispatch and at the shortest notice. And so that gives us an idea of how he was advertising his business, and as well as what he saw as the value he was giving to his customers. So maybe there's some personality insights in advertisements. And then if you know of someone who you expect might have a directory advertisement, there's actually a helpful section, the index to advertisers, which of course you can look at the table of contents to find which page that's on. And the index to advertisers will list all of the people advertising in that year's city directory, and it will give a page number so you can go find that advertisement. So if you already have someone you know who had a business, then that can be a quick way to look up if they have an advertisement that year. Next slide, please. And so I just went over a few possibilities of what you can do with the directory. There's all kinds of different things you can do. For example, you can track someone's time span of residence. If you know someone who may have lived in multiple cities, you can get when they were in St. Louis, for example, at a more granular level than you would on the every 10-year census. And something else would be to look for would be early directories. So a lot of times in cities will have a random like early city directory that came like years before the more standard ones. And these often have unique information in them. So they're always good to look at. I remember looking at one in Cincinnati that actually listed everyone's place of origin, because I guess at the time most people came from somewhere else. So that seemed like an important thing to note. And finally, although I've talked about city directories in an urban context, there are also rural directories. And so one example of that would be Prairie Farmer. And in that you could find information such as what type of products your ancestor produced on their farm, who owned a Model T. And one time I was looking at one of these and I even saw an advertisement that caught my eye that was saying that my ancestor owns some kind of farm implement. Everyone else should buy one too. So you truly never know what you're going to find in a directory. And so I hope this will give you some strategies you can apply to your own research. Any types of organizations mentioned or businesses, remember you can always go back to the city directory to find out more. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jen, for that amazing webinar. We really appreciate it. If you guys enjoyed this webinar and want a refresher, you will be able to check it out on our YouTube page. If you want to send the link out to friends who you think that might appreciate it or need it and hit a brick wall in their own research, you can do that as well. That should be going up in the next couple of days. And if you've registered, and if you're here, you have, then you'll be getting an email as a reminder that that will be available then. So just a quick reminder about that. Upcoming webinars, if you enjoyed this webinar and want to check out our future work, we only have this is our last webinar for the year, but in 2024, we will have our first one on Facebook for small museums. So if you know anyone who might need this for their small museum, or if you're part of a small organization that might benefit, you can go ahead and register now or anytime before January 8th at backlog-archivist.com/webinars. And you can also check out any future webinars that we post at that location. So that is it for future webinars. And if you are still hitting brick walls, even after like listening to this webinar a couple times maybe, feel free to reach out to us and we would be glad to help. So that being said, does anyone have any questions? You can go ahead and unmute yourselves. Just try to be cautious of everyone else speaking. Okay, guys, couple more seconds to think about it. If you think about a question after this webinar is over and you would like to hear back from us, you can also reach out to us at hello@backlog-archivist.com as well. Well, if no one has any questions for Jen, we'd like you guys to hope you guys have a good night and happy holidays. Thank you for coming. All right. Good night.
Yep.